Members of the Finks Bikie gang have unleashed vicious threats after an Adelaide court hearing. Their anger erupting as police pulled them over after the jailing.
How does a man wrapped in tattoos, power and loyalty end up alone behind concrete walls, unheard? Brent Reker chased freedom on two wheels, built empires out of fear, and promised he could outrun consequences. But every choice narrowed the road. Rival guns, prison doors, and a mind under siege closed in fast. This isn't just a bikie story. It's about control slipping, warnings ignored, and how a life built on strength can collapse silently before the final fall comes.
Surrounded by police, furious Fink Andrew Madurak lets fly at television crews.
Get his thing off my car! I'll deal with you, get off!
From footy fields to inked skin, the making of Brent Reker. Brent Reker's story did not begin in smoke-filled clubhouses or under flashing police lights. It began quietly in Victoria, where he was just another kid chasing footy, friendships, and a sense of belonging. Teachers knew him as restless, but not reckless. Friends remembered him as loyal, energetic, someone who wanted to stand out, but did not yet know how. After finishing school in Perth, that restlessness deepened. The structure of normal life failed to hold him, and the pull of something louder, darker, began to take shape. By his mid-teens, Brent's weekends stopped revolving around sport and started drifting toward tattoo parlors and bikie clubhouses. These places offered what footy never could: identity. Ink was not decoration to him, it was commitment. At 16, he marked his body with his first tattoo, flowers etched into his shoulder for his sisters Lauren and Caitlin. It was personal, emotional, and symbolic. That moment mattered because once Brent started wearing his story on his skin, he never stopped adding to it. The bikie world fed something inside him: the roar of engines, the rigid loyalty, the unspoken rules, and the respect taken rather than asked for. Brent was not content to simply hang around. He wanted to build something of his own, something with weight. Perth, at the time, was already dominated by established clubs, and stepping into that space was not just bold, but also provocative. Still, Brent pushed forward, convinced that confidence could outrun consequence. His move was calculated. Instead of forming a small local crew, Brent reached across the ocean. He contacted the Canadian chapter of the Rock Machine Motorcycle Club, a group already known for its violent reputation and history of conflict. After back-and-forth discussions, permission was granted. That approval was more than administrative. It was a green light to bring an international outlaw brand into Australian territory. When authorities officially confirmed the Perth chapter, it sent a clear signal that the balance of power was being challenged. Established clubs saw it exactly that way. The Rebels Motorcycle Club did not welcome outsiders, especially not ones carrying foreign colors and ambition. Online threats escalated quickly, and words soon turned into action. Nightclub brawls, firebombed vehicles, and arson attacks followed. Each incident tightened the atmosphere, turning Perth's bikie scene into a pressure cooker. Police watched closely, knowing violence was no longer hypothetical. Inside the Rock Machine hierarchy, Brent rose fast. He served as sergeant-at-arms, a role that demanded enforcement, intimidation, and absolute loyalty. It suited him. He did not avoid confrontation, and that reputation spread. But with visibility came risk. During this period, his actions crossed from intimidation into criminal certainty. An extortion attempt involving a brutal ultimatum brought his momentum to a halt. When the victims went to the police, Brent's shield disappeared. Patching over, reinvention through the Finks Brotherhood. When Brent Reker walked out of prison, he did not return to Perth or attempt to rebuild the Rock Machine legacy he had helped ignite. That chapter was finished, burnt out by jail time, internal fractures, and too much attention from police. Instead, Brent went back to Melbourne, carrying grief, reputation, and an unresolved hunger for purpose. Prison had stripped him of momentum, but not ambition. If anything, it sharpened his belief that he could still command respect, just under different colors. That belief led him to the Finks Motorcycle Club, one of Australia's oldest and most insular outlaw clubs. Founded in Adelaide in 1969, the Finks were nothing like Rock Machine. Where Rock Machine thrived on open confrontation and notoriety, the Finks prized secrecy, discipline, and internal loyalty above all else. Their black and white colors were instantly recognizable, and their logo, Bung, the court jester from The Wizard of Id, carried a mocking defiance that outsiders often misunderstood. Patching over into the Finks was not a casual decision. Their membership process was notoriously strict, designed to filter out ego-driven riders and police attention magnets. Brent was both. Yet his experience, fearlessness, and ability to command loyalty worked in his favor. He understood hierarchy, knew how to manage men, and had already proven he would go to prison without naming names. That currency mattered more than a clean record ever could. By the time Brent officially wore Finks' colors, the club was under immense pressure. Years earlier, they had been targeted during Operation Avatar, a coordinated police effort aimed at dismantling outlaw motorcycle clubs across Australia. Raids, surveillance, and prosecutions had drained the club financially and psychologically. In 2015, that pressure peaked when police raided dozens of properties, arresting members on charges ranging from drug trafficking to weapons offences and extortion. Legal fees mounted, chapters weakened, and the Finks' reputation in Melbourne suffered badly. Brent saw opportunity where others saw collapse. He believed image mattered as much as muscle. Internally, he pushed the idea that the Finks needed reinvention to survive, not through surrender, but through control. When the club redesigned its patch in 2014, giving Bung a more aggressive look, it was partly symbolic. The message was simple: the Finks were still here, still dangerous, but evolving. Brent aligned himself with that narrative, presenting as both enforcer and reformer. Enemies on all sides. Power, paranoia, and the price of visibility. By the time Brent Reker settled into his role at the top of the Finks, his life had become a constant balancing act between authority and exposure. Power brought status, but it also painted a target on his back. As national president, Brent was no longer just another rider blending into the pack. He was a symbol. To rivals, he represented encroachment. To the police, he was a pressure point. To some inside his own club, he was a gamble. Brent believed visibility could be managed. He gave interviews, framed Bikie culture as misunderstood, and spoke openly about rights, freedom, and territory. To him, this was a strategy. If the public saw Bikies as human rather than monsters, police pressure might ease. But that approach cut against decades of outlaw culture built on silence and intimidation. Every public statement risked backlash, and that backlash came fast. Rival clubs, especially the Rebels, never accepted his return to Victoria under Finks' colors. Old conflicts did not disappear with new patches. They evolved. Threats circulated quietly, passed through intermediaries, half-spoken but fully understood. Brent knew it. His family knew it. The fear did not stay at the clubhouse. It followed him home, into ordinary moments, into sleep. In the early hours of May 31, 2018, that fear became real. At 4:40 in the morning, while Brent, his wife Tess, and their 2 young sons slept, gunfire tore through their home. Bullets ripped through walls, punched into neighboring houses, and shattered any illusion of safety. Outside, his car was set ablaze. Flames lit the street as shots were fired from a passing vehicle. The attack was fast, coordinated, and deliberate. CCTV later showed the chaos in fragments. A car is igniting, a man running. A weapon was fired from the back seat as the vehicle fled. 10 minutes later, police found what they believed was the getaway car burning nearby. The message was unmistakable. This was not intimidation. It was an escalation. Brent's family had been brought into a war they never chose. Miraculously, no one inside the house was physically hurt. But survival came at a cost. From that night on, Brent lived in a state of permanent alert. He moved houses, scanned shadows, and reacted to every unfamiliar sound. His mother later said he was always looking over his shoulder, always listening, always afraid the next attack would succeed. His greatest fear was not for himself. It was for Tess and the children. Police charged a rebels enforcer with the attack, confirming what everyone already suspected. The threat was real, organized, and ongoing. For Brent, the line between leadership and endangerment blurred. Protecting his club now meant risking his family. Protecting his family meant abandoning the very world that defined him. There was no clean exit. The revenge that changed everything. One order, one night, no return. 3 months after the drive-by shooting, Brent Reker was no longer operating from a place of strategy or restraint. Fear had settled into his daily life, and anger simmered just beneath the surface. He believed enemies were everywhere, watching, waiting, spreading humiliation as much as violence. In that state of mind, one allegation was enough to push him over the edge and undo everything he claimed he was trying to rebuild. The trigger came through a phone call and a conversation that police were already listening to. A close female friend told Brent that private photos of her had been shared online without consent. She named a man she believed was responsible. To Brent, this was not just gossip or embarrassment. In his world, disrespect demanded a response. Silence meant weakness, and weakness invited attack. The idea that someone connected to him had been humiliated publicly struck at his authority. Unknown to Brent, covert listening devices were already in place as part of a wider drug trafficking investigation. Investigators recorded his conversation, capturing his anger, his certainty, and the way he spoke as someone used to giving instructions rather than suggestions. The words mattered. In organized crime cases, intent often matters more than action, and Brent's voice became evidence before the night even arrived. On September 9, 2018, a group of Finks members tracked down the man Brent believed was responsible. Police officers were already nearby, monitoring movements, aware of rising tension. They had been instructed not to intervene. The risk was considered too high. What followed was brutal and fast. The victim was beaten with fists and a tire iron, an act meant to punish, intimidate, and send a message. It was not a warning. It was a statement. For Brent, this was meant to be control. Instead, it became the final thread, tying him back to the very violence he claimed to be leaving behind. When arrests followed, there was no surprise, only inevitability. Brent was taken into custody and placed inside Melbourne Assessment Prison. This time felt different. The media tone shifted. Sympathy vanished. The narrative changed from targeted leader under attack to violent figure, incapable of stepping away from his past. Initially, Brent was granted bail. Those close to him said something inside had finally started to break open. He spoke about getting out, about legitimacy, about addressing his mental health. He had begun the painful process of tattoo removal, a symbolic step away from the identity he had worn on his skin for decades. He found legitimate work. He talked about his children. For the first time, there were signs of someone preparing to walk away rather than double down. That hope did not last. The Office of Public Prosecutions appealed the bail decision, arguing Brent should never have been released. The Supreme Court agreed. In February 2019, his bail was revoked. He was sent back behind bars, and whatever fragile progress he had made collapsed overnight. To Brent, it felt like punishment for trying to change. Locked inside his own head. Prison, pressure, and a system that didn't listen.
In hospital after being shot during an attack on his home in a suburban street in Adelaide. Police are hunting several men who stormed the house last night. Officers say the property belongs to a man.
When Brent Reker returned to custody after his bail was revoked, the environment he entered was nothing like the one he had briefly escaped. The man who came back was not the same person who had once thrived on structure, hierarchy, and dominance. This time, he arrived fractured, exhausted, and already aware of what isolation could do to him. From the beginning, he told prison staff exactly that. He did not mask it. He did not posture. He warned them plainly that being alone was dangerous for him. Prison records later showed a pattern that was hard to ignore. Brent repeatedly expressed distress, agitation, and suicidal thoughts. He complained of boredom, frustration, and feeling trapped inside his own head. To people who knew him, this was not manipulation. It was a man losing his grip on control, the one thing that had always defined him. Inside prison, status meant nothing. Reputation could not protect him from his own thoughts. At Melbourne Assessment Prison, staff flagged concerns and moved him between observation levels, attempting to manage risk without fully removing him from the general system. It was a compromise approach, one that relied heavily on monitoring rather than treatment. Brent, however, needed stability and specialized care. Instead, his days became a cycle of waiting, uncertainty, and escalating anxiety. Each cancelled appointment, each denied request, added another layer of frustration. Eventually, authorities transferred him to Port Phillip Prison in May 2019, placing him in a specialist unit designed for inmates with significant mental health issues. For a brief period, there was hope that this move would help. The unit had more oversight, better trained staff, and fewer opportunities for isolation. Brent responded positively at first. Those around him noticed he was calmer, more communicative, less volatile. It was not recovery, but it was containment. That progress did not last. In November, he was moved again, this time back to Ravenhall Prison. On paper, Ravenhall was modern and well-resourced. In reality, according to whistleblowers and staff, it struggled with inexperience and inconsistency. Systems existed, but they were not always applied with the nuance required for inmates in fragile psychological states. For someone like Brent, that difference mattered. Back at Ravenhall, familiar patterns returned. He complained of being bored, unheard, and ignored. He became increasingly fixated on small issues, including a cancelled dental appointment. To staff, it may have seemed trivial. To Brent, it represented loss of agency. He reportedly told a guard, "Do we have to hurt ourselves to get what we want?" Later, he told a prison doctor that inmates had discussed harming themselves if their demands were not met. Whether that was desperation or protest mattered less than the clarity of the warning. Concerns grew that Brent was influencing other prisoners. Prison management decided it was best to move him to a different unit, separating him from those he might sway. When guards came to transfer him to the Forbes unit, Brent told them directly that he had no plans to harm himself. Despite his history, he was placed under hourly observation rather than constant supervision. A death foretold, the final hours no one stopped. By the time Brent Reker was moved toward the Forbes unit, the warning signs were no longer subtle. They were written across months of reports, conversations, and near misses. Staff knew his history. They knew about the earlier attempts. They knew about the volatility, the fixation, the constant push and pull between control and collapse. Yet decisions were still made, as if risk could be managed by routine instead of reality. When guards arrived to transfer him, Brent did not resist physically. He spoke calmly. He told them he had no plans to harm himself. For a man who had spent his life projecting strength, this calm should have been read differently. Those closest to the situation later said it was not a reassurance. It was resignation. He had learned that honesty rarely changed outcomes, and he was tired of fighting a system that spoke in procedures rather than understanding. Hourly observation was signed off. In prison terms, that meant long stretches of time alone. For someone with Brent's documented mental state, it was a dangerous gap. Inside the cell, frustration turned inward. He covered the walls with toilet paper, not as decoration, but as a barrier. He wedged the mattress against the door, blocking entry, reclaiming control over the only space left to him. These were not random acts. They were deliberate, escalating signals. Guards noticed something was wrong when routine checks failed to bring a response. From a rear window, they saw a chair wedged inside the shower. That sight triggered urgency. Forced entry followed. When they reached him, Brent was already on the floor. There was no dramatic final confrontation, no shouted threats, no spectacle, just silence. Attempts to revive him failed. In that moment, the long chain of decisions collapsed into a single irreversible outcome. News of his death spread quickly through Bikie circles, prisons, and the media. Reactions were split. Some saw inevitability, others saw negligence. Those who had warned staff felt vindicated, not relieved. Whistleblowers later said the move never should have happened. Brent should have remained in a specialist unit, in a padded cell, with no hanging points, no electrical access, no isolation. Those options existed. They were simply not used. For his family, explanations offered little comfort. His mother spoke openly about what he had become and what he had lost. She remembered the boy with small ears and a big attitude, the son who loved riding more than anything, the man who could clear a street just by revving his bike. She also spoke about the fear that followed him everywhere near the end, the way he jumped at sounds, the way he never truly rested. A Victorian coroner opened an investigation into the circumstances surrounding Brent's death. The focus was not only on his final hours, but on the entire chain leading there: his mental health history, the risk assessments. The decision was made to move him out of specialist care, the reliance on observation instead of intervention. Each detail became part of a larger question. Was this preventable? Brent Reker's life had been shaped by choices, some reckless, some calculated, many driven by identity and loyalty. His death, however, was shaped by systems. Systems that saw warning signs and logged them, but failed to act with urgency. In the end, the man who once commanded rooms full of riders died alone, unheard in the place he had warned them about the most. Legacy in ruins, power, loyalty, and the cost of becoming a symbol. After Brent Reker's death, silence moved faster than truth. Inside Bikie circles, words were chosen carefully. No one wanted to say too much, and no one wanted to say the wrong thing. Respect for the dead collided with fear of attention, and what remained was a quiet reckoning. Brent had lived as a symbol of power, reinvention, and defiance. In death, he became something else entirely, a warning. For years, Brent had built his identity around strength. Strength in loyalty, strength in fearlessness, strength in control. Those qualities elevated him quickly in outlaw culture, but they also narrowed his options. Once you become the man people expect to lead, intimidate, and never bend, stepping away feels like betrayal. Brent understood that. Even when he spoke about leaving the club and going legitimate, those words fought against years of reputation. Walking away is easy to imagine and almost impossible to survive. Among the Finks, reactions were conflicted. Some mourned him genuinely, remembering his commitment, his riding skill, and the way he defended members when pressure was high. Others quietly questioned the path he chose. They wondered whether visibility had brought too much heat, whether ambition had outweighed caution, and whether the club would now pay for a legacy that ended badly. In outlaw culture, loyalty does not erase consequences. Outside that world, public reaction was less forgiving. Headlines reduced Brent's life to labels: bikie boss, criminal, inmate. Complexity rarely survives media framing. His attempts at reform, his mental health struggles, and his efforts to leave behind violence were often overshadowed by his worst decisions. For many, his death was seen not as a tragedy, but as an inevitability. That perception hurt his family the most. His mother's grief cut through that noise. She did not defend his crimes, but she refused to let him be flattened into a stereotype. She spoke about a boy who loved his sisters, a young man drawn to speed and freedom, and a father terrified of failing his children. She spoke about nights when he couldn't sleep, about fear that never left him after the drive-by shooting, about how prison changed him in ways that never reversed. Her words reminded people that even men who live violently still feel pain deeply. Brent's death also reignited uncomfortable questions about prison mental health systems. Whistleblowers did not speak anonymously out of bitterness. They spoke because they had seen the same patterns repeat. Risk assessments acknowledged danger. Reports documented distress. Transfers happened anyway. Inmates with influence were moved for management reasons rather than care reasons. In that environment, prevention became secondary to order. For younger bikies watching from the outside, Brent's story carried weight. It showed how fast ambition could elevate someone, and how quickly it could collapse. Power offered protection until it didn't. Loyalty protected you until it trapped you. Identity gave purpose until it became a cage. Brent had tried to reshape that identity late in life, but the momentum of his past moved faster than his plans. In the end, Brent Reker did not leave behind a clean legacy or a simple lesson. He left contradictions, a man who wanted control but lost it, a leader who preached reform but returned to violence, a father who feared for his family yet couldn't escape the world that endangered them. His story forces an uncomfortable truth. In outlaw culture, survival often depends less on strength and more on timing. Brent ran out of time. The illusion of control, how authority accelerated the collapse. Brent Reker spent most of his adult life believing control was something you could seize, hold, and shape through force of will. In the bikie world, authority is often confused with safety. The louder the engine, the heavier the patch. the more people step aside. For a long time, that illusion worked for Brent. But control, once challenged from too many directions at once, becomes fragile. And when it breaks fast. As national president, Brent was expected to manage pressure without showing strain. He carried negotiations, internal discipline, police attention, and rival hostility on his shoulders. Leadership demanded certainty, even when none existed. Any hesitation risked being interpreted as weakness, and weakness, in that world, invites removal. That expectation forced Brent into a permanent performance, one where fear could never be acknowledged and vulnerability could never surface. The drive-by shooting shattered that performance. From that moment, Brent's authority no longer felt protective, it felt provocative. He began to realize that power did not shield families, homes, or sleep, it only redirected violence. That realization created a conflict he never resolved. Stepping down meant admitting limits. Staying meant accepting risk. He chose to stay, but the cost followed him everywhere. Inside prison, the illusion of control disappeared completely. There were no colors, no hierarchy that mattered, no influence that could override institutional procedure. Brent's attempts to assert himself through requests, complaints, and demands were met with process rather than response. Each denial reinforced the same message: the rules no longer bent for him. For someone whose identity was built on command, that loss was psychologically devastating. His behavior in custody reflected that internal struggle, blocking doors, covering walls, issuing ultimatums, and escalating language were not random acts of aggression. They were attempts to reclaim agency. In environments where autonomy is stripped away, even negative attention can feel like power. Brent was not seeking chaos for its own sake. He was trying to force acknowledgement in a system designed to minimize individual disruption. What made his situation more dangerous was how his history shaped staff perception. Brent was known as influential, assertive, and capable of mobilizing others. Those traits, once valuable to clubs, became liabilities in custody. Decisions about moving him between units were influenced by concerns over control, not care. Managing influence took priority over managing risk. In that calculation, mental health became secondary. This is where illusion turned fatal. The belief that Brent could manage himself, that observation was sufficient, and that warnings were exaggerated allowed critical time to pass without intervention. Systems rely on categorization. Once someone is labeled difficult rather than vulnerable, responses harden. Brent crossed that line early, and crossing back is rare. His final days showed how completely control had inverted. The man who once dictated terms now reacted to cancellations and delays with desperation. Small frustrations felt enormous because they symbolized powerlessness. When control disappears suddenly, the mind searches for any remaining lever. For Brent, that lever was the only thing prison could not take away: his own body. Brent Reker did not die because he lacked strength. He died because strength, as he understood it, had no place left to operate. Authority failed him when it mattered most. Influence became isolation. Control became confinement. The illusion that had carried him through years of violence and leadership could not survive a system that responded only to compliance. When that illusion collapsed, there was nothing left to hold him upright. A system under scrutiny. When warnings become paperwork. After Brent Reker's death, attention shifted from the man to the machinery around him. Questions that had lingered quietly were suddenly unavoidable. How does someone with repeated, documented warnings about self-harm move through multiple facilities without sustained intervention? How does a system designed to assess risk allow risk to accumulate until it becomes irreversible? The answers, as they often are, lived in process. On paper, Brent's file was thick with alerts. Notes referenced agitation, threats of self-harm, frustration with isolation, and prior attempts. Each entry acknowledged danger. Each response followed protocol. That distinction mattered. Protocol ensures consistency, but consistency can become rigidity when situations demand flexibility. In Brent's case, the system responded correctly in steps, but never decisively in outcome. Risk assessment tools are designed to categorize, not predict. They rely on observable behavior, recent incidents, and stated intent. Brent learned quickly how those boxes worked. When asked directly, he sometimes denied plans to harm himself. Those denials mattered more than the pattern behind them. Staff relied on the latest statement rather than the cumulative trajectory. In isolation, each decision made sense. Together, they formed a gap wide enough to fall through. Transfers between facilities exposed another weakness. Each move resets context. Information traveled, but urgency often did not. A specialist unit recognized his fragility and stabilized it temporarily. The decision to move him back into a general setting prioritized logistics and influence management over continuity of care. In systems built to manage populations, individual nuance is often the first casualty. Whistleblowers later described a culture stretched thin. Younger staff, high turnover, and competing priorities created an environment where red flags blended into background noise. Mental health support existed, but access depended on availability, timing, and perceived compliance. Brent's assertiveness worked against him. He was seen as demanding rather than distressed, disruptive rather than deteriorating. The moment that defined the failure came when hourly observation was deemed sufficient. Observation is not treatment, it is a pause, not a solution. For individuals with complex trauma, grief, and loss of identity, time alone can magnify harm. The decision assumed stability where none existed. It assumed compliance where history showed volatility. The coroner's investigation widened the lens. It examined not just the final hours, but the decision chain. Why specialist care ended, why warnings did not escalate, and why alternatives like padded cells were not used. These questions were not about blame alone. They were about pattern recognition. Brent's case was not unique, it was simply visible. For prison administrators, the challenge is constant. Balance safety, order, rights, and resources. Yet systems are judged by their edge cases, not their averages. When someone repeatedly says they are unsafe alone, the margin for error narrows to zero. In Brent's case, the margin was treated as flexible. The aftermath brought recommendations, reviews, and renewed focus on mental health pathways. But reforms often arrive after loss, not before. Families are left to absorb conclusions that feel clinical against personal grief. For Brent's mother, explanations could not replace presence. For his children, reports could not restore a father. Brent Reker's story became a case study not because of who he was, but because of where the system failed to adapt. It showed how warnings can become paperwork, how risk can be acknowledged without being reduced, and how prevention collapses when urgency is diffused across departments. The lesson is uncomfortable and simple. When someone tells you they are not safe, believing them must override procedure. The weight carried home, family, fear, and the cost beyond the club. Long before prison walls closed around Brent Reker, the cost of his life choices had already followed him home. Leadership did not end at the clubhouse door. It sat at the kitchen table, crept into bedrooms, and lingered in the quiet moments meant for rest. For Brent's family, danger was not abstract. It had names, sounds, and a memory that refused to fade after the bullets stopped flying. The night of the drive-by shooting permanently altered the rhythm of their lives. Safety stopped being assumed and started being negotiated day by day. Brent became hypervigilant, reacting to small noises, scanning streets, and changing routines. What once looked like confidence hardened into suspicion. For his wife, living beside him meant sharing that fear without ever fully being able to remove it. For their children, it meant growing up inside tension they could not understand but could feel. Brent's greatest contradiction lived there. He justified his position in the bikie world as protection. Yet it was that very role that put his family at risk. The promise of control collapsed under reality. No amount of reputation could guarantee a quiet night. No authority could stop a bullet from choosing the wrong wall. That realization haunted him, and those closest to him saw it clearly. He was not reckless at home, he was terrified. His mother watched this transformation with pain and helplessness. She had already lost one son. Watching another unravel was unbearable. She spoke about how riding once brought Brent peace, how speed and movement calmed his mind. When that outlet was replaced by confinement and fear, the imbalance became obvious. She saw a man trying to protect everyone while slowly breaking himself apart. When Brent was imprisoned again, that distance did not bring relief. It brought a different kind of fear. Phone calls became lifelines. Missed calls became panic. Each update carried uncertainty. The system treated Brent as an inmate. His family saw him as a husband, a son, and a father slipping further away. Those two realities never aligned. After his death, the impact spread unevenly. Media coverage focused on the bikie boss. Public debate centered on prison systems. The family absorbed a quieter loss. There was no closure in reports or findings, only absence. Children who would grow up with memories shaped by fragments. A wife left to reconcile love with fear. A mother left with questions no process could answer. Brent's life had been lived loudly, but grief arrived silently. It settled into ordinary days, into birthdays, into moments where his presence should have been. For all the talk of power, influence, and legacy, what remained most visible was what was gone. The club moved on. Systems reviewed procedures. The family learned how to carry loss forward. This is the cost rarely accounted for in stories of outlaw culture. Beyond violence, beyond rivalry, beyond prison sentences, there are homes that never fully exhale again. Brent Reker's choices reshaped his world, but the deepest consequences were carried by people who never wore a patch, never sat at a clubhouse table, and never chose that life at all. Reputation versus reality, how the Bikie myth broke down. In the outlaw world, reputation is currency. It is built slowly, defended aggressively, and rarely questioned out loud. Brent Reker understood that better than most. His rise depended on the belief that fearlessness equals strength, and that strength guarantees survival. For years, that equation worked. People stepped aside, rivals paid attention, members followed. But reputation has a flaw that only becomes visible under pressure. It cannot protect you from everything. The myth Brent lived inside promised control. Control over territory, over loyalty, over outcomes. It suggested that if you were feared enough, respected enough, the chaos would orbit you without touching what mattered. The drive-by shooting shattered that myth in seconds. Reputation did not stop bullets. It did not spare neighbors. It did not pause long enough to check who was inside the house. In that moment, the legend failed the man. Inside Bikie culture, this contradiction is rarely addressed honestly. Strength is performative. Vulnerability is dangerous. Admitting fear risks eroding authority. Brent followed those rules faithfully, even as the cost mounted. He spoke publicly about rights and brotherhood, but privately lived with the knowledge that the lifestyle had placed his family directly in harm's way. That internal conflict was never resolved. It only deepened. Prison stripped reputation down to its limits. Outside, Brent's name carried weight. Inside, it carried paperwork. Influence became a management problem rather than an asset. His assertiveness, once interpreted as leadership, was reframed as defiance. The same traits that elevated him in one system undermined him in another. Reputation proved transferable only until the rules changed. This breakdown exposed a broader truth about outlaw mythology. The narrative celebrates loyalty but punishes exit. It praises strength but ignores fragility. It promises family while endangering families. For many inside that world, the myth survives because questioning it threatens identity itself. Brent reached the point where reality could no longer be ignored, but by then, the cost of leaving was higher than the cost of staying. Attempts to reframe himself came too late. Tattoo removal, legitimate work, and conversations about stepping back were real, but they collided with years of accumulated perception. Reputation moves more slowly than intention. To the system, he remained a risk. To rivals, he remained a target. To the club, he remained a symbol. There was no space left where he could simply be a man trying to change. After his death, the myth endured for others. Clubs continued, hierarchies adjusted. Stories were retold with emphasis on loyalty and silence. Yet beneath that continuity, cracks showed. Younger members watched closely. They saw how quickly status turned into isolation. They saw how mental health concerns were interpreted as weakness. They saw how power did not guarantee safety when systems, rivals, and time aligned against you. Brent Reker's story did not destroy the Bikie myth, but it challenged it in ways that could not be easily dismissed. It showed that reputation can amplify risk as easily as it deters it. It showed that control is often conditional, borrowed, and temporary. Most of all, it showed that an identity built solely on strength leaves no room to fall without breaking. In the end, the myth survived, but the man did not. That imbalance is the quiet truth beneath the noise. For every legend that outlives its subject, there is a human cost rarely acknowledged. Brent lived by the rules of his world. What failed him was the belief that those rules would protect him forever. No clean exit. Why walking away was never simple. People often ask why Brent Reker didn't just leave. From the outside, the answer seems obvious. After prison, after the drive-by shooting, after the fear settled into his home, why not step away and choose safety over status? The truth is harsher. In the world Brent belonged to, there was no such thing as a clean exit. Leaving was not a decision. It was a negotiation with history, reputation, and people who did not accept resignation letters. Brent understood that better than anyone. His rise had been public, deliberate, and forceful. He had worn leadership openly, spoken to the media, and positioned himself as a figurehead. That visibility gave him authority, but it also meant every move he made was watched. When someone like that steps back, it is not seen as growth. It is seen as a vulnerability, and vulnerability invites challenge. Inside outlaw culture, loyalty is permanent, but membership is conditional. You can fall out of favor, be pushed aside, or be forced out, but choosing to leave disrupts hierarchy. It raises questions others would rather avoid. If one leader can walk away, what does that say about the structure holding everyone else in place? Brent knew that even expressing the desire to exit could be interpreted as betrayal. There was also the weight of unfinished business. Enemies do not disappear because intentions change. Rivals measure you by what you represent, not by what you promise to become. The drive-by shooting proved that past actions linger. Even if Brent had stripped every tattoo and cut every tie, there was no guarantee the violence would stop. Walking away did not mean walking free. It meant walking exposed. Prison complicated everything further. Institutions do not reward reinvention easily. To the system, Brent was a known quantity. His efforts to go legitimate were fragile and easily overturned by a single appeal. When his bail was revoked, the message was clear: past identity outweighs present intention. That realization crushed what little hope remained. Psychologically, leaving also meant confronting loss on multiple levels: loss of status, loss of identity, loss of the only structure that had ever truly made sense to him. For someone who had built his life around belonging to something larger than himself, isolation felt more dangerous than conflict. The club, for all its flaws, offered certainty. Leaving offered uncertainty without protection. There is a misconception that strength makes departure easier. In reality, strength hardens roles. The more you embody a symbol, the less room you have to change without resistance. Brent had become a symbol long before he wanted out. By the time he reached for something different, the image others held of him was heavier than his own will. Even his attempts to distance himself were misunderstood. Tattoo removal was read by some as a weakness. Legitimate work was seen as temporary. Conversations about leaving were met with skepticism. In worlds built on permanence, transformation is treated as a threat rather than a victory. When strength becomes silence, the cost of never admitting you're losing, Brent Reker was raised, shaped, and rewarded in environments where admitting struggle was dangerous. From the clubhouse to the prison wing, strength was measured by endurance, not honesty. You rode through pain, you absorbed pressure, you handled problems quietly or violently, but never vulnerably. Over time, that mindset became automatic. By the time Brent realized he was losing control internally, he no longer had the language to ask for help in a way the system could truly hear. This is where his story becomes less about bikies and more about men taught to survive by suppression. Brent did speak up. He told prison staff he was not safe alone. He warned them directly. But the way he communicated was shaped by a lifetime of authority and confrontation. His words came out as demands, ultimatums, and frustration. To the system, that sounded like manipulation. To Brent, it was desperation wearing the only armor he knew. In prison culture, vulnerability without submission is often misread. When someone asks for help while still asserting control, the request loses credibility. Brent could not switch off the posture that once kept him alive. He did not know how to ask gently. He only knew how to insist. That disconnect proved fatal. His warnings were logged, not felt. Silence filled the gaps where conversation should have lived. Mental health assessments happened, but they focused on behavior rather than meaning. Staff observed what Brent did, not why he did it. Blocking doors, covering walls, and escalating complaints were treated as disruptions rather than distress signals. The more he acted out, the less seriously his emotional collapse was taken. There is a cruel irony in how strength functioned at the end of his life. The traits that once made Brent formidable became barriers to care. His confidence masked fragility. His history overshadowed his present. His influence triggered management responses instead of therapeutic ones. He was seen as someone who needed controlling, not containing. This pattern reflects a broader failure in environments that deal with high-risk individuals. Systems are designed to respond to compliance, not complexity. People who break down quietly receive care. People who break down loudly are restrained. Brent broke down loudly because silence had never kept him safe before. In the final stretch, the silence that mattered most was not his. It was the silence between warnings and action, between assessment and intervention, between what was known and what was done. Strength, as Brent understood it, left no room for collapse. When collapse came anyway, there was no framework left to catch him. Brent Reker did not die because he refused help. He died because he could not ask for it in a language that systems respect, and because those systems could not translate urgency from someone they had already labeled difficult. His story exposes a truth many would rather avoid. When strength is the only acceptable emotion, suffering becomes invisible until it is irreversible. After the headlines fade. What? Brent Reker's story still demands. When the news cycle moved on, Brent Reker's name slipped from front pages into footnotes, but the questions his life raised never really went away. Stories like his tend to harden into cautionary tales, simplified until they feel distant and resolved. That reduction is comfortable. It allows institutions, communities, and audiences to believe the outcome was inevitable rather than constructed through a series of choices that could have gone differently. Brent's story resists that comfort. It demands attention precisely because it sits at the intersection of personal responsibility and systemic failure. He made violent choices. He led within a world built on intimidation. Those facts matter, but they do not erase the reality that he also signaled distress repeatedly, nor do they excuse the mechanisms that treated warning signs as administrative noise. The temptation after deaths like his is to assign ownership of blame and close the file. Criminal history becomes justification. Difficult behavior becomes an explanation. Yet prevention does not operate on moral judgment. It operates on risk, pattern, and response. Brent's case shows what happens when response lags behind recognition. For policymakers, his death underscores the danger of fragmented care. Mental health support cannot function effectively when continuity is disrupted by transfers and management decisions. Each move resets trust, context, and momentum. Stability matters more than facilities. Consistency matters more than checklists. Without them, even well-designed systems struggle. For correctional staff, his story highlights the importance of interpretation. Not all warnings arrive politely. Some arrive wrapped in anger, frustration, and defiance. Systems trained to respond to compliance often miss urgency expressed through conflict. Bridging that gap requires training, resources, and a cultural shift that recognizes distress regardless of tone. For families, Brent's story echoes a familiar grief. Loss compounded by public judgment, privacy eroded by curiosity, and mourning complicated by headlines that flatten complexity. They are left carrying both the absence and the narrative, expected to reconcile love with accountability in silence. For those inside, outlaw culture, his life exposes the limits of myth. Strength did not protect him, loyalty did not save him, power did not translate across systems. The same identity that elevated him also narrowed his exit until there was none left. That contradiction is rarely spoken aloud, but it is quietly observed. Most importantly, Brent's story challenges how society thinks about prevention. Prevention is not prediction, it is a response. It is acting decisively when patterns converge, even when the individual involved is unpopular, difficult, or morally compromised. The measure of a system is not how it treats the easy cases, but how it responds when complexity is highest. Nothing about Brent Reker's life fits neatly into a single lesson. He was neither hero nor caricature. He was a man shaped by choices, environments, and expectations that rewarded strength while punishing vulnerability. His death did not just mark the end of a life, it exposed gaps that remain open. After the headlines fade, what remains is responsibility.
and the owner of the home is a member of the Finks motorcycle club. Officers investigating the crime say they're frustrated.
Responsibility to learn without simplifying, to improve without waiting for the next tragedy, to remember that warning signs are only useful if they lead to action. Brent Reker's story still demands that much. The road that ends here. Final reckoning of a bikie life. Brent Reker's life followed a road built on speed, loyalty, and confrontation. From the beginning, movement defined him. Riding was freedom, noise was power, and stillness felt like failure. That momentum carried him upward fast, but it also meant he never learned how to slow down safely. Every phase of his life demanded intensity, and when intensity became unsustainable, there was nothing beneath it to fall back on. The bikie world rewarded Brent early. It gave him structure when normal life felt empty, and recognition when anonymity felt suffocating. Clubs provided hierarchy, identity, and purpose, but they also demanded permanence. Once he stepped fully into that world, leaving it required more than desire. It required rewriting identity, reputation, and expectation all at once. That was never a fair fight. Leadership amplified everything. Success brought enemies. Visibility brought scrutiny. Loyalty brought obligation. Brent wore all of it publicly, believing strength could absorb consequence. For a time, it did. But pressure compounds. Rivalries do not fade. Systems do not forget. The weight grew heavier than his ability to carry it, even as he insisted he could. The drive-by shooting marked the moment illusion collided with reality. Violence crossed into his private world and refused to stay outside. From then on, fear followed him constantly. He adapted by becoming more alert, more guarded, more tense. What looked like vigilance was actually erosion. Safety never returned, only temporary pauses between threats. Prison stripped away the last illusion of control. There were no engines to outrun thoughts, no hierarchy to anchor identity. Authority became irrelevant. Influence became suspicion. In that environment, unresolved grief, fear, and loss surfaced without distraction. Brent tried to communicate distress using the only language he knew, but it was the wrong language for the place he was in. The system heard his words, but did not absorb their meaning. Risk was acknowledged but managed cautiously rather than urgently. Each transfer resets context. Each assessment diluted responsibility. By the time action was required, momentum had already carried events beyond recovery. The gap between knowing and doing became fatal. Brent's death was not the result of a single failure. It was the endpoint of accumulation. Accumulated pressure, accumulated loss, accumulated misinterpretation. Each step made sense in isolation. Together, they formed a path with no exit. That is how most tragedies occur, not suddenly, but gradually. His legacy resists simplification. He was not just a bikie boss, nor just a victim of the system. He was a man shaped by environments that prized toughness and punished vulnerability. He made choices that harmed others, and he also lived with consequences that outpaced his ability to adapt. Both truths exist simultaneously. For audiences watching from a distance, his story offers discomfort rather than closure. It challenges assumptions about strength, control, and accountability. It forces recognition that systems fail most visibly when dealing with people who do not fit neatly into categories of deserving or undeserving.